Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Financial Issues Forum, featuring Professor Dror Goldberg in conversation with Professor Richard Silla, and speaking on his book, Easy Money, American Puritans and the Invention of Modern Currency. I'm Jim Kelly, Director of the Gabelli Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham. On behalf of the Gabelli School, a very warm welcome. The Financial Issues Forum, organized by the Gabelli Center and our wonderful co-presenters, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York, have sponsored more than 70 events since 2020 alone, which have drawn close to 10,000 attendees. We are very proud of this dynamic collaboration, and a full archive of our video content will be shared in the thank you email which you will receive. Professor Goldberg will speak with Professor Silla for about 40 minutes, at which point he will address questions submitted through the question field that is located below the video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during our event. We will be addressing as many of them as possible during the session. In a moment, David Cowan, President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, will give a full introduction of Professor Goldberg and Professor Silla. All attendees of today's event will be receiving digital copies of Professor Goldberg's book, with information coming to you following our event. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to David Cowan.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be back with you and all our friends in the audience. Our speaker today is a senior faculty member in the Department of Management and Economics at the Open University of Israel. His PhD is in economics from the University of Rochester, and he also has a law degree from Tel Aviv University. He's published in multiple peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Economic History, Economic Theory, the Journal of Monetary Affairs, and the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. But none more endear to us than our own magazine, Financial History, where Dror has an article in the upcoming issue. Dror worked at Texas A&M and then spent a sabbatical at the NYU Economics Department, courtesy and guest of Professor Richard Silla. Now, Dick is well known to our viewers, Professor Emeritus of Economics and the former Henry Kaufman Professor of the History of Financial Institutions and Markets at NYU Stern School of Business. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author and co-author of multiple articles and books like Alexander Hamilton on Finance, Credit, and Debt, or Alexander Hamilton, the Illustrated Biography, and then the epic A History of Interest Rates, now in its fourth edition. He's a current trustee and former chair of the Museum of American Finance from 2010 to 2020. And since a number of our students are tuned in, Dick and I are co-teaching a class on financial history at Fordham's Gabelli School. Now, I first met Dror when he was visiting NYU about a dozen years ago, when the museum had an exhibit that actually had one of these very rare 1690 documents. He was explaining its incredible value and significance at that time, and he's here today to share that knowledge with you. Recently, the Wall Street Journal reviewed Easy Money and gave it a very favorable one, include calling it, quote unquote, an engrossing narrative. And so we are looking forward to, in person, another engrossing narrative. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Professor Richard Silla in conversation with Professor Dror Goldberg.
Thank you, David, and hello, Dror. Great to be with both of you and with all of our viewers. I'm going to pick up a piece of modern money. It has Alexander Hamilton's picture on it. It's a $10 Federal Reserve note, and I would urge our listeners today to do something they probably rarely do, and that is to read their money. And if you read what it says on this note, it says, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." That's the main message of it, the note. We're going to discuss today one of the great inventions of modern history that has all kinds of current applications. I'll just mention some of those applications that we will hope to touch on later on in the discussion. cryptocurrencies. It's a very hot issue today. Modern monetary theory, central bank digital currencies, and the sort of discipline that's necessary to operate a modern monetary system effectively. But this all began long ago, almost 3 centuries ago, in what was a peripheral part of Western civilization, namely the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had only been in existence for about 6 decades. And they came up with a great monetary innovation. And to say what the significance of it is that, in a sense, we can say today that the whole world is Massachusetts. And so I'm going to ask Dror to kind of give us an idea of what the Massachusetts monetary innovation of 1690 was, and then we'll kind of talk about why it happened there, when it did, and so on. But Dror, I think you should give us now a kind of outline or a summary of the key findings of your book.
Sure. So until 1690, all the currencies all over the world relied in some way, directly or indirectly, on something of intrinsic value. It could be a gold coin, it could be paper, which was a promise for a gold coin, it could be a cow, it could be tobacco, it could be many things, but at the end there was something with intrinsic value. The money we have today and the money that was created in 1690 for the first time relies on something totally different, on the circulation of an object into the treasury in tax payments and out of the treasury in paying to government employees. And Massachusetts was the first to come up with that. And of course, it didn't change the history of money immediately. But since 1971, when gold was cut off from the monetary system, we are back in that situation where nothing supports our money legally other than it's being legal tender for taxes. So that's the innovation, and that's what the book is about.
Great. So what exactly happened in Boston in 1690, and why did it happen at that particular point in the history of monetary innovation, we could say?
Sure. So in 1690, Massachusetts tried for the first time to occupy French Canada. This was the biggest military expedition ever. They were completely not prepared for it, and they were certain that they would win because it was partly a religious war. They were Puritans. They thought they would easily beat Catholics, plunder Quebec City, and use the plunder to pay the soldiers. It did not work out as planned. This was actually not something unusual in the early modern era. In the early modern era, countless armies went bankrupt. They couldn't pay their soldiers. There was a military revolution in the 16th century with the cannons and larger firearms. That made wars very, very expensive, and countless armies actually stopped marching or defected or mutinied because of lack of pay. So Massachusetts 1690 seemed to be like one of those cases. But 1690 was different in various ways. And Massachusetts was different in various ways from all previous military forces that faced this problem. In 1690, Massachusetts could have come up with paper money and in principle could just produce money and force everyone to use it under penalty. That actually happened 5 years earlier in Quebec City. The very same place they tried to occupy did exactly that. Printed paper money and forced everyone to accept it, and also promised that gold shipped from France will be used to redeem the paper money. So Massachusetts could have done that. That was something not new at all. I mean, everybody knew about China. Marco Polo told everyone that Chinese paper money was supported by the death penalty, actually. So they could have done that, except that they had a constitutional problem with England. It was an English colony, and they needed to be on good terms with England. England, a few years beforehand, shut down an independent mint that Massachusetts had, so they could not produce anything that looked too much like money. So what they did, they issued something and they called it bills, and they did not force anyone to accept it. It was just like an IOU. The Treasury issuing an IOU, that's okay. That's permissible under English law. It looks nothing like a coin. So that was something they could do. They could not do the old-fashioned way of forcing paper money on a population, especially during war. That was kind of the obvious thing to do. But in 1690, they could not afford to do that. Now, Massachusetts was also a different society. It was actually both the intellectual and the commercial hub of English America. They had Harvard College, today is of course Harvard University, and they controlled all the trade of the English colonies throughout the Atlantic. So they had intellectuals, they had merchants that actually could come up with something totally new. And being a colony, they were far away from vested interests, like the king, like the royal mint, that sabotaged any attempt to create paper money in England. So it was this kind of accidental combination of circumstances that enabled this innovation in 1690 in Massachusetts.
Could you describe exactly what the innovation was in the sense of what did they do that they sort of stumbled onto modern money by creating convenient denominations of debt? But basically, I think it's kind of one form of government that was exchanged for another. The soldiers were paid in a new form of money. And the question is, why did this succeed? You know, what was the key factor?
Right. So at first, when the soldiers returned from Quebec, they expected pay for 3 months of sailing back and forth, and they were granted something called a debenture. That was completely standard. It was a single financial instrument that stated the amount that the Treasury owed to that particular named soldier, something like £9 and 15 shillings and 6 pence. One of them survived. It's called a debenture, different from today's debenture. It's something different. So each soldier received this huge amount of money equal to wages of 3 months. Probably some of them tried to go shopping with that, buy food for their families, and they couldn't. So the government at first said, okay, let's accept the debentures themselves in taxes. Maybe that would make sellers in the markets more willing to accept these debentures. But the denominations were simply inconvenient. So £9, 15 shillings and 6 cents, it's not round. And as I just told you, it's actually a wage of 3 months service. It was too much. So actually the entire innovation was to split this huge amount into smaller bills of 5 shillings, of 10 shillings, of 1 shilling, of 2 shillings, of £1 or 10 shillings, something like that. Just break it to a smaller change and offer the soldiers to each one of them that he would trade in his debenture and receive all these bills in exchange. So this is actually an open market purchase. The government took in new money and exchanged it for a debenture, which it then took back. And actually that was supposed to kind of solve the problem. The population was not very happy with it. It was something new. They knew this was something different from everything that they experienced before. There was no intrinsic value of something at the end of the road. But then the elite kind of tried to prop up the money, and some important people wrote pamphlets to encourage people to accept it. And eventually, apparently, the population went along and accepted this money. And actually, this first they did an experiment. The debt was 40,000 pounds. They first of all printed 7,000 pounds. When they realized that it worked, they printed the rest of the debt. That was it. Now, I can say that in some sense they coined the debt itself, because what is the action of coinage that has existed since the 7th century before the Common Era? Coinage is when you take a lump of, let's say, gold, and you cut it into small standardized pieces and you stamp something on them, and that's it, and you make them circulate. And that's what Massachusetts brilliantly did with the debt. They took this huge debt that they owed to each soldier and they cut it into small standardized pieces and put a stamp on it, and that's it. So they coined the credit itself, and it worked.
But my reading of the book is that the key reason it worked is that the government said that these new bills of credit, they would be eventually called bills of credit, could be used to discharge your obligations to the government, your tax obligations. That wasn't that a crucial feature of that?
Yeah, absolutely. They could not support this money in any other way because of those peculiar constitutional circumstances with England. So they said, we will accept it for taxes. And that was written on the paper money, and it was written in the law. And it was supposed to help indirectly, it was supposed to help the sellers in the markets accept the money. They knew that they could pay their very high taxes with these bills. That was supposed to induce the sellers to accept the bills voluntarily from the soldiers, and eventually that's what happened. So the bills went from the treasury to the soldiers, from the soldiers to the sellers, and from the same sellers, when they were taxpayers, back to the treasury, and that was it. The circulation went full circle, and nobody needed silver or gold or anything else.
That's the key part of the innovation, I guess. Now, initially, as you say, they had a debt of 40,000 pounds total, but they only issued 7,000 pounds of bills, and they said you can use these to pay your taxes. And didn't they also say that once you pay the money in, the money would be destroyed? I read something in the book about they actually burnt up the initial issues of paper money. So this initial issue was, so you might comment on that, but also they extended the scope of the money in a couple of years. By 1692, it wasn't just legal tender to pay your taxes, which is sometimes called a limited legal tender, but by 1692, they said, not only can you use this to pay your taxes, but you can use it to discharge debts you owe to other people. And that made it sort of a full legal tender. Why did the currency develop that way? I mean, what allowed them to turn a limited legal tender into a full legal tender in just a couple of years?
Right. So the constitutional situation was quite complicated. I'll try to explain it very briefly. In 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Company lost its charter, lost its right to exist as an English corporation, and they received a dictator from England, and the new regime was called the Dominion of New England. In 1688 and 1689, there was a revolution in England, the Glorious Revolution, and in Massachusetts, they imitated it, and they deposed the governor of the deposed king. They joined the Glorious Revolution, and they lobbied the new king, William III, to give them a new charter or restore the old charter. And they did that in 1690. That was the moment. That's why they had to be on very good terms with the new king. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake of issuing the independent money as they had before. In 1691, they received the new charter. And when they got it in the colony in 1692, they immediately realized we no longer have a constitutional problem with England. We can now do whatever we please with this money. So they extended its legal tender capacity to include the debts as well. And that's exactly what we have today. Our legal tender is for taxes and debts, not for spot transactions. That was never the case. So that was the reason why it developed in this way, 1692.
Now, Massachusetts was the innovator here, but I've done some study of this development myself, and in the later period, I noticed that this spread rather quickly, like innovations do. You'd say Massachusetts was the first user of this kind of money, but very quickly, most of the other American colonies, I think, in fact, by the 1750s, just about all of them latched onto this innovation and were issuing bills of credit. And then the British government cracked down, especially on the legal tender aspect of the money. And the Currency Acts of 1751 applied to New England, and 1764 applied to the other colonies. They tried to get rid of this monetary innovation. And I think that was part of the reason Americans were in a mood to revolt. We said no taxation without representation, but we also said, we're issuing this legal tender money between consenting adults, we might say, and the British didn't really have a right to interfere with it. But it didn't really catch on to the whole world for another couple hundred years. The American Constitution said Congress had the right to coin money and regulate the value of it. It didn't say Congress had the right to print money. And in fact, you might infer that Congress didn't have that right, because they also said no state shall make anything other than gold or silver legal tender in the payment of debts. So this was kind of a reaction, a sort of undoing of the innovation in a way. Why do you think that happened?
So this mechanism of supporting the circulation of money through tax payments is good enough to make it circulate, but it does not protect you from inflation. And the colonies printed too much. Massachusetts at first was very, very disciplined. They increased taxes first, and then they printed money in the same amount. So those 7,000 pounds, that was right after they legislated taxes worth 7,000 pounds. So there was a problem of liquidity. They did not try to get away with the deficit or anything like that. First taxes, then printing paper in the same amount. So there was no reason for prices to rise in the long run. After that was done, they printed the rest of the debt, 33,000 pounds, and on the same day, they decided to issue paper money in the same amount. So that was the first step. They were disciplined, and they kept this discipline for 20, 25 years, and then they lost the discipline. Maybe because Puritanism itself was kind of in decline. I'm not a scholar of religion, I'm not sure about it, but it's something worth thinking about. They were extremely disciplined, and even more so when you think that they never experienced high inflation in their lives. They didn't have that, but somehow they knew that they were playing with fire when they printed the paper money without any constraints such as a stock of gold to back it. So they managed to hold on to this discipline for 2 decades. The rest of the colonies, together with them in the 1710s, they started to inflate, and that gave paper money a bad reputation. The Continental of the Revolutionary War kind of sealed the deal. It lost almost all its value, partly because the Continental Congress did not eventually get the authority to impose taxes. Originally, the plan was that it will have this power to tax, but it never got this authority. And that's it. The paper lost almost all its value. And paper money was kind of defamed by it in some sense. But it also bought Americans their independence. So I think they wanted to maybe keep the option of future paper money possible without prohibiting it totally. And I think that's why the Constitution says what it says and does not say certain things about paper money.
Now we know that as a result of the Constitution, Hamilton and other financial leaders put us on what we might now call pre-modern money, in the sense that the Hamilton's Mint Report of 1791 defined the new U.S. dollar as a certain amount of gold and a certain amount of silver, and that prevailed in American history with a few exceptions or a few deviations until the 1930s. You could exchange paper dollars for gold or silver coins, and Franklin Roosevelt ended that domestically in 1933 by calling in all the gold and melting it down and putting it into Fort Knox. But we continued internationally to be on this pre-modern form of money until the 1970s. The Bretton Woods system, and I'm speaking today from halfway between Boston and Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods system was sort of the last hurrah for the pre-modern form of money. Nixon cut the link of the dollar to gold in 1971. And since that time, that's half a century ago now, the whole world has become Massachusetts. The question, I would say, is why did it take almost 3 centuries for us to get from Massachusetts to get to where the whole world is now Massachusetts? Why did it take so long?
Because after every period of inflation, people did not want inflation anymore, so they went to gold. So it was like that back and forth. Also, you can mention the Civil War, in which both sides printed their own paper money, and convertibility to gold was suspended for quite a few years. And eventually the 20th century, with its 2 world wars and the Great Depression, that kind of broke the back of gold, and people kind of gave up on it until we have hyperinflation again, maybe. If we ever have really high inflation, not like the 70s, but much, much higher, like the triple-digit inflation I grew up with in Israel, maybe we'll go back to gold. Even now, I mean, 300 years, that's not a lot in monetary history. China had paper money for 500 years, and they gave up on it because of inflation. Eventually, they returned not even to silver coins, but to lumps of silver. That's how much they lost faith in the government. So it's all a question of how much you abuse the system of unbacked paper money. The more you do it, the more likely you are to return to gold. Maybe gold is not totally dead. Maybe it depends on central banks.
A lot of people think that we ought to go back to a gold standard. You hear that quite a bit. Well, let's turn to the modern world now. We have new forms of monetary innovation, cryptocurrencies being one. You commented in the book on why you have some skepticism about whether cryptocurrencies are really currencies at all. What is your take on cryptocurrencies as a modern form of monetary innovation, like the Massachusetts 1690 innovation?
So I am skeptical about cryptocurrencies. I'll start with Bitcoin, which is the most extreme and famous case. So many people don't understand, why don't we all switch to Bitcoin? I mean, it's so obvious that it has this automatic limit on its quantities, so there will not be inflation. Well, the problem with Bitcoin, and many people ignore that, is that it is not legal tender for paying taxes. So right now, like in the past couple of weeks, many Americans had to pay money to the IRS. And the IRS doesn't accept Bitcoin. It accepts US dollars. It has to accept them, actually, because they are the only legal tender. It also chooses voluntarily to accept checks or other financial instruments drawing on bank accounts that are fed by dollars. It accepts all that. It doesn't accept Bitcoin. And why should it? The government itself prefers to accept its own money. Bitcoin doesn't do that. And when you have so many taxes, and most businesses pay taxes more than once a year, you have this huge welfare state when you pay so many taxes so frequently. And the welfare state puts the money back into the economy in the hands of tens of millions of people. It controls so much of the economy. When you have all these payments going through the treasury in the federal government's money, Bitcoin is in a very poor position to compete. Maybe 100, 200 years ago, when the state was very, very small, maybe 1 or 2% of GDP in peacetime, maybe then Bitcoin had a chance. But today, when the government in every developed country is, I don't know, 30% of GDP at least, Bitcoin has a really tough battle for it. And that's why I'm skeptical about Bitcoin. There's no reason for a government to accept Bitcoin as legal tender, except for a government that does not issue its own coin, like El Salvador. It's not a coincidence that the dollarized El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. And even there, it's not the unique legal tender. You can still pay taxes in dollars. So that's about Bitcoin. Now, there are the stable coins that promise conversion one-to-one with the US dollar or other legal tender currencies. That has a better chance. It's not something very new in principle, only technologically it's new. The US, before the Civil War, had more than 1,000 private banks that printed their own paper monies, and they promised to redeem these paper monies for the official legal tender currency of the United States, coins of gold and silver. And it worked, maybe not so well. Other people say it worked very well. So that can work. We know it can work if those issuers of stable coins maintain credibility, that can work. But we should also remember that once a serious war came, the Civil War, the government, without hesitating, totally eliminated this nice system of more than 1,000 banks issuing their own money, and it started printing its own money. So even if it can survive in the short run, these stable coins might be destroyed by the government whenever the government wishes. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So that's it about crypto.
Yeah, I think there's a good analogy between the U.S. pre-Civil War, where all these banks were issuing, each bank issued 6 denominations of banknotes. I think they say there were 8,000 or 9,000 different looking pieces of paper floating around, all claiming to be claims on gold and silver. Of course, you had to take it to the bank, which might be far away. That was another problem of that era. And the Civil War basically made our money the way it is now essentially an obligation of the federal government. The greenbacks were issued, of course, in the Civil War, and our money still is green on the back. Now, a problem you referred to in the book is that, like, people could start a bank and issue currency, and before the Civil War, today, almost anyone can start a cryptocurrency. It's like an innovation that is not patented, and does that present a problem for cryptocurrencies? The fact that anyone can produce a cryptocurrency?
Sure. So cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, they promise this upper limit. We are not going to print or issue too much of it, or not more than 21 million units can be mined. So there is this scarcity built into the system of Bitcoin. That's very nice, because we know that we don't want money to be not scarce. So Bitcoin itself, it has scarcity built in it, but throughout the realm of possible cryptocurrencies, it is not scarce because anyone can start it. So it's like if someone comes to you and tells you, well, why don't you join my pyramid scheme? Someone did it when I was in 2nd grade. Well, your optimal response is to say, hey, that's a great idea, I'll start my own. I actually didn't do that, but it is possible. I mean, if anyone can do it, yeah, I can do that too. So maybe that's one reason why you have, last time I checked, more than 20,000 crypto assets that claim to be cryptocurrencies, and none of them is actually a currency in the sense of most people using it to buy their goods and services. So, yeah.
Let's turn to another modern topic of some interest. There's something called modern monetary theory has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. And in your book, you say that modern monetary theory might just as well be called Puritan monetary theory or Massachusetts monetary theory or even Mather monetary theory after Cotton Mather, who was one of the Puritans in on the innovation of 1690. So I take it that modern monetary theory isn't really so new. And what do you think about its originality or its validity?
So I think that the modern monetary theory, so-called, is correct initially. Its original premise is correct. It was originally called actually modern money theory. And then some copywriter, I guess, changed it to modern monetary theory, which is far more presumptuous. Modern money theory is exactly that. I mean, the title in my book says modern currency, and we are talking about the same thing. Money that is legal tender for taxes and is not limited in any way by gold or any other commodity with intrinsic value. Now, the problem with modern monetary theory is that superficially they are like the Puritans, but they lack the discipline. So as I said, the Puritans, they first raised taxes, then they printed money in the same amount. The whole point of modern monetary theory is to try to get away with printing more than taxes. So printing a lot, well, taxing maybe a little less, and hoping there will not be inflation. So they totally lack the discipline, and it's not a coincidence. That's the entire point. We can print money, well, let's party. That's what they're saying. My point is the opposite. There is no limit on printing money, so let's be very, very careful. So we start with the same point. Legal tender for taxes is what makes our modern currency circulating, but we take it in completely opposite directions. They are not afraid of inflation, even if they say they are. I don't buy them, I don't buy it, and I'm very afraid of inflation. I lived through it, I know what it is, I know what it can cause to a country. So that's the similarity, and there's the difference.
Right. Now, what about going on from the cryptocurrencies? What about central bank digital currencies? What are your thoughts on that? If a digital currency is an innovation worth thinking about, I've always felt that like the Civil War United States government basically took us away from all these different types of currencies issued by banks and kind of nationalized currency production in the United States. I always thought that if there was some validity to cryptocurrencies, that probably the central banks would do the same thing that happened in the United States in the 1860s. That if it's a worthwhile innovation, the central banks will take it over and we'll have central bank digital currencies. But I notice all kinds of people seem to be against this and think it's a terrible idea. What are your views on a central bank digital currency?
So more than anything, I think that it is technologically inevitable, because so much of our physical existence has been swallowed by the smartphone. It seems almost absurd to think that in 20, 30 years we will still use paper money and coins like it's the Middle Ages. So I don't think it is avoidable. The question is, how do you do it? And I know there are some ideas to enable you to pay with the digital currency voluntarily, but you don't have to. There will still be the option of paper money, or maybe there will be your entry into the system will be validated, but then what you do with the money will stay behind some screen, and it will be confidential and your privacy will not be infringed. I hope that is the case. I hope it is technologically and legally feasible. Actually, I refer to it in the book only to say that my point about modern currency is not restricted to the physical form of paper. It can be paper made of cotton, made of polymer. It can be a token coin. It can also be a central bank digital currency. I think at some point there will be legal tender digital currency produced by the state. Whether it will completely crowd out physical money or not, I don't know, but I think it will have the same legal status. I don't think governments will try to be very innovative. I don't think they will try to force everyone to use it. I don't think they will forego their privilege of deciding what to accept for taxes and what not, because they now realize, even if they still haven't read my book, they know from modern monetary theory how helpful it is to their money that they accept only that for taxes. That's that.
So I gather you would say that a central bank digital currency will work if the government accepts the central bank digital currency in payment of taxes. So that's
True.
one of the key
Yeah.
insights of your whole book, I think, right? And certainly,
Yeah.
if the government did issue a central bank digital currency, I don't see how it could avoid accepting it in payment of taxes. Well,
Yeah,
I think
that's another.
we've hit the main topics. I think it's time to allow the audience to ask some questions, and things we missed out on will probably come up in the Q&A. So David and Jim, are there any questions that are coming up from the audience?
Sure, and we want to thank both of you for that very engaging conversation. Our first question is from Michael Scarlatos. He wants to know why this act was more evolutionary than merchants, typically goldsmiths, ranging from China to Sweden, well before the Massachusetts innovation, who innovated liquid paper checks based on one's metal balances with the smith.
Right. So in the histories of money, it is common to mention China, Sweden, the goldsmiths in London. So some of these were actually monies, like in China, definitely, in Sweden also for a very brief period. But they were kind of backed directly or indirectly with goods of intrinsic value. So in China, the first paper money was backed by gold and silver and copper. So that is not modern currency. And then it was backed by the death penalty, as Marco Polo reported. We don't have that today, fortunately. In Sweden, it was also backed by copper, huge copper plates, because they had only copper coinage. So that was also backed by something, and obviously the goldsmiths in London as well. Another problem with all these earlier paper monies, all these claims of earlier paper monies, is that they were not paper monies actually. So when you read about the banknotes of goldsmiths bankers in London, you read banknote, you say, oh, okay, banknote is money. But no, it wasn't money. So these banknotes, they were actually notes issued by banks, but nobody thought about them as money. They were worth £100 on average. What is £100 in 17th century? Well, the doorman of the Bank of England made £20 a year.
Oh.
A talented blacksmith made £20 a year. Poor people could live on £10 a year. So a skilled craftsman needed to work 5 years to earn $100. That wasn't money. We would call it a bond, some other form of financial instrument, but it was definitely not money, not in the sense of currency. So this is actually a common error. It wasn't currency. Yeah, they called it banknote. We refer to $20 bills as a banknote, but we mean really different things. So whenever you hear a claim about banknotes, you should always check the denominations and compare them to something, to the common wage, to the price of bread, to something to give you the right perspective on whether it was money or not.
Okay. Very good. I encourage everybody, the questions are coming in now very nicely, but please submit a question at this time if you have one. Here's one from Shreya Naidu. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of a globally standardized currency? That's really looking into the future.
Well, it seems possible. For example, I mean, the United States is a federation, the European Union is a federation, and they have unified currencies. You could extend it to the entire world. I think many people will be too afraid of it. But it's possible if all the world's governments accept it for money, for taxes, and the global government will accept it for its own taxes. It can work. I don't think it will happen, but sure, it can work.
I guess the euro was the first example of that attempt to standardize among local currencies, and question of expanding from there.
Well, last time I looked, we didn't have a global government, so it'd be hard to have a global government issuing a global currency. So I do remember that my friend, the late Paul Volcker, did say it probably made some sense for the world to at least think about having a worldwide currency.
Okay, David?
Michael Shore would like to know, typically would merchants who accepted the bills hold them for an extended period of time because of tax payments being made at lengthy intervals? Is it also correct that they could not have deposited these bills in a bank while waiting for the time that taxes were due?
Okay, so there were no banks. The British didn't let colonists have banks. They actually tried to have banks just a few years before they printed the government paper money. They tried to have two banks, and the English, it wasn't yet the British, the English sabotaged both of them. So there was no bank. But this question does raise an issue of whether you can do everything with some currency and only on tax day, even if it's only every quarter, convert the money into the legal tender currency and then pay your taxes. So yes, you could do it. I mean, that is one weakness of this theory, that relying on taxes. So it kind of depends how heavy are the taxes and how frequent are the taxes. And we actually have a very famous example from history of an object that was legal tender for taxes but failed to circulate in the economy because the tax was small and it was infrequent. And the example, it's also relevant in the spring, the money changers in the temple in Jerusalem. Why did they have money changers in the temple? Because Jewish law required tax payments 3 times a year at the temple by pilgrims. And for the temple tax, they needed a very special coin that was more pure than the Roman coin, a coin from the city of Tyre, now in Lebanon. And this was the only legal tender for the temple tax. But it was the tax was too small, too infrequent. The supply of these coins was too small. So even though it was legal tender for an important tax, it did not circulate. That's why there were money changers in the temple. So an object could be legal tender for taxes and yet not circulate. And today, with the welfare state, as I said before, it's far more difficult to get along without the object that is legal tender for taxes.
Okay. Here's a question from Vladimir Augustin. Benjamin Graham, in the depths of the 1930s depression, developed and later proposed a convertible foodstuffed commodities-based currency. He pointed out that this was done in ancient China. Has any modern economy implemented something like this? And what does your research suggest about the viability or hurdles of such a currency linked to commodities?
So I know that some private money advocates like Larry White from George Mason and George Selgin, they've been thinking about these commodity-based, commodity-backed monies with this or that basket of commodities. Nobody tried that, as far as I know. It's kind of difficult for any commodity-backed currency to keep up with economic growth. So maybe that's why gold was gone after one generation of the Bretton Woods system. The US needed more and more dollars just for the growing economy, more people, more transactions because of economic growth. And also there was the Vietnam War, the space program, the war on poverty. But even without them, eventually there would have been the increase in the money supply probably would have outpaced the increase in gold. So these systems, they they could be perfect in a non-growing economy that is stable, like what we think of the Middle Ages. But when the economy grows so fast, and after World War II, that was the fastest growth in history, any kind of backing is a serious problem. What are you going to do? Going to reduce the promise of conversion? Then you lose credibility. Or you just hope that nobody would notice? Well, that's what the US did, and it worked until 1971. So you have this problem when economic growth could be higher than the growth of the stock backing the money.
By the way, here's the book that the questioner asked about, Ben Graham, Storage and Stability.
So about 100 years later, the United States, not the United States, Massachusetts, during the Revolutionary War, to combat hyperinflation, actually issues a commodity bond that would pay off either in 6% interest or a basket of commodities like sheep's wool, etc. Speaking on other currencies, Shreya Naidu wants to know, what are your thoughts? Oh, no, that was the other one. Excuse me. We had an early Oyster Brian. What are your thoughts on the Swiss Wehrbank and Berkshires? Are you familiar with those? These are the merchant to merchant. So in the Berkshire Mountains here in the U.S., they have merchant to merchant notes. It's like their own private currency that you can pay another merchant with. Had you any familiar? Since you're not familiar with that, we can move on to another one. Nicholas Lopez, one of our students, does cryptocurrencies banning in certain authoritarian regimes like China undermine its fundamental value add of autonomy and sovereignty from government regimes and centralized financial systems?
So what is the question? Does it?
Yeah. Does crypto's banning, you know how crypto's banned by certain authoritarian regimes like China, undermine its fundamental value add of autonomy and sovereignty from government regimes and centralized financial systems if certain banning takes place?
Sure. Governments want to remain the monopolists. That is kind of obvious. Then they can control the money supply, issue whatever they want to finance anything they want, and try to have some monetary policy for the business cycle. So it's kind of understandable why they prohibit it. Whether they are successful or not, I don't know. I think that all cryptos, including Bitcoin, they have a problem of alienating the governments too much. And if Bitcoin ever becomes such a problem that the government wants to kill it, it can treat Bitcoin like it treats Iran and just blacklist any financial institution that has anything to do with it. That will be a very severe blow. The government can also enter, let's say, the Bitcoin market and just play with its value, buy and sell every day huge amounts just to destabilize it. I think the government is so powerful that if they really want to sabotage crypto, they will do it. It's bad news for privacy. Yeah.
I was going to say a historical example of that is what happened in the U.S. during the Civil War when the government wanted all banks to convert to national banks. They didn't do it. Some of the state banks continued, and they were still issuing their currency. So the U.S. government put a prohibitive 10% tax on anyone who paid out a state banknote, and that's the privately issued banknotes disappeared at that point, and our currency became a liability of the federal government. So that's just an example of what a government can do. If it doesn't like a currency, it can get rid of it in one way or another.
I have a question I'd like to ask for myself, really, is a lot of my students don't use paper money anymore. They just use credit cards or an app on their smartphone to pay for all their daily needs. Are they ahead of their time? Is that the future?
So I think eventually these applications and the credit cards, they're all linked and based on bank accounts that are denominated in dollars and are fed by dollars or by promises that firms make to the bank to pay dollars. It's all about promises to pay dollars. And legally speaking, these promises mean legal tender currency. If any such promise ever goes to court, it can be discharged with paper money and coins issued by the United States government. So that's kind of the edifice of the entire financial system, even if most of the time we don't actually use these objects in trade. It's still the foundation of everything, legally speaking.
You touch upon this, I believe, a little in the book. I know you do a little bit, but there's another wild event going on at this time, the 1692, the Salem witch trials. And maybe explain a little what that is for some of those that might not know what it is, but any implications back and forth between your currency that's being issued and these witch trials?
So actually, when I realized that this paper money was issued in the 1690s in Massachusetts, that's the first thing I thought about, because I'm not an American, and between the Mayflower and the Thanksgiving and the Boston Tea Party, that was the only event I was familiar with. I think many people are like that. So I heard of the Salem witch trials, and I tried to ask some people, like in the beginning, like, is this possible? Like, how could it be so brilliant and yet so stupid at the same time? So I cannot solve the puzzle of Salem witches, but I can say that both of them were actually the result of the intellectual activity at Harvard. So Cotton Mather, who we've mentioned, was both a scholar. I mean, he was a scholar at Harvard. He was both a witch hunter, an exorcist, even before the paper money. And he was one of those who issued pamphlets to support the paper money. So he considered himself a monetary theorist. We have the pamphlet that he wrote. His father-in-law was the treasurer, by the way. So he was an intellectual. So he was interested in monetary theory. And intellectuals in the 17th century also investigated witchcraft. That's what they did. Newton invested as much time in the Bible, looking at the dimensions of the Holy Temple to try to figure out the secrets of the universe, just as he did watching stars. So witchcraft was completely mainstream science in the 17th century. So there's no contradiction. And the 17th century actually featured the scientific revolution. And what was that about? It was about understanding those forces of nature that operated without physical touch. Gravity, air pressure, magnetism, and witchcraft. It seemed kind of one of those. So there's no contradiction. I cannot explain the witches, but I can explain that both of these phenomena are because Harvard College was such a hyper-intellectual place among the colonies. So that's how I look at it.
You know, Isaac Newton was a contemporary of these people in Massachusetts, and John Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, wrote an essay about him once where he went over Newton's papers, and Newton, who discovered some of these great scientific laws and developed calculus and all that, one of the great contributors to modern society, also believed in alchemy. So alchemy was sort of, like witchcraft in Massachusetts. Alchemy was something that Newton actually took very seriously. And Keynes said he wasn't the first of the moderns. Newton was not the first of the moderns. He was the last of the magicians.
Well, we're coming up on the end of our hour. And David, do you have any final question, or I'll close it off?
Just one, you mentioned the currency was burned, correct, Dror?
So they burned the initial amount. They burned 10,000 pounds. Then they realized, well, actually, it's kind of useful. Let's circulate the rest.
So it just reminds me of during World War II, when Hawaii was threatened under invasion by the Japanese, we overprinted the words Hawaii for the currency that would circulate there. And what to do with the currency that was there, they actually burned it. And so then sent out the overprints. Not a great morale builder, by the way, for the people there, but that's life. And it just made me think about that. But that's this closing comment. Thanks a lot. You all will enjoy the ebook that you're going to get.
And So, Dror, thank you very much. And also, Dick, for sharing your wisdom with us today. And we'd remind our viewers that our next scheduled event is on May 17th, when we have Pulak Prasad writing on his new book, What I Learned About Investing from Darwin. So that should be interesting. Hope to see you all on May 17th. Goodbye.